And we're live. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our virtual readings gallery this evening. My name is Claire, and I am the event coordinator for Village Books in Bellingham and Linden, Washington, and I am delighted to be hosting tonight's event. A few things to know before we get started. If you look in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, there is a green follow button. I encourage you to click on that so that you can see the variety of events that we have coming down the road here at Village Books. We do still have our robust event programming that you're used to at Village Books, even though it's sadly not in person. We are glad that we can still see you virtually. To those of you who made a contribution at registration, we appreciate that. While we are very happy to be able to provide our event programming for free still, we do appreciate those of you who kicked in a few dollars to support that event programming. We really do appreciate it. And if you didn't, that's fine too. Like I said, we're happy that we get to provide this programming for free too. So I also want to tell you about an event that's coming up on Tuesday I'm very excited about. That's Tuesday. What month are we in? October 20th at 7 p.m. I'm really excited about this book. Sierra Crane Murdoch is going to be in the readings gallery, the virtual readings gallery, for her book Yellow Bird, Oil, Murder, and a Woman's Search for Justice in Indian Country. It's an important book, and I will be interviewing her. And so that's Tuesday, October 20th at 7 p.m. I encourage you to check that one out. So we are going to disable the chat just up until the Q&A portion of this event. I'm going to do that right now before I think about it, before I forget about it, rather. So if during the event you have any questions that you want to ask, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that it says Ask a Question. So please feel free at any point tonight to click on Ask a Question. A dialog box will pop up. You can type your question right into that box. We'll keep it there, and then when we get to the Q&A portion of the event, we will see the questions that are gathered there. And we encourage you to ask lots of questions this evening. This is a fascinating subject tonight, so I'm sure that there will be questions. I do want to remind everyone that this virtual readings gallery is a safe space. Any user exhibiting hateful or inappropriate behavior will be dismissed from the event immediately. Okay, and then lastly, maybe it's the most important button on this screen, center screen right there. It says Purchase Edge of the Map here. If you click on that green button, it's a direct link to the Village Books website where you can purchase copies of Edge of the Map. We do encourage you, if you are feeling inspired by this evening's event and interested in the book, the author would be delighted, as would an independent bookstore, if you purchased the book from Village Books and supported that way. And finally, before we get to the good stuff, this event is part of the Nature of Writing series. It's a co-sponsored event with North Cascades Institute. The North Cascades Institute is a conservation organization focused on transformative learning experiences in nature, including place-based environmental education, outdoor recreation, health and wellness, conservation, environmental justice, and community engagement. Since 1986, they have helped connect people, nature, and community through science, art, literature, and the hands-on study of the natural and cultural history of the Pacific Northwest. If you want to learn more about the amazing work that the North Cascades Institute does, I encourage you to go to ncascades.org. It's a wonderful organization, and we are so happy that we get to partner with them. Okay, now to the fun part. Our featured author, Johanna Garton, interviewed more than 75 friends and family of Christine Boskoff and Charlie Fowler in writing Edge of the Map. Conversant in Mandarin, she conducted several weeks of research and interviews near the site of Boskoff's death in China. Garton is a journalist, attorney, and nonprofit consultant who lives in Denver, and Edge of the Map is her second book. So she is here to present this book right here, Edge of the Map, The Mountain Life of Christine Boskoff. So please join me in welcoming Johanna Garton. This will take just a second. I'm going to do a little screen do-si-do. There you go.
Hi. Oh my gosh. Claire, thank you for that amazing introduction. I'm so happy to be here this evening in Bellingham with all of you. This was actually the weekend of my rescheduled book launch. My book, Edge of the Map, was released in April, and I had a book launch planned in May out in Seattle, which was obviously bumped, and it was bumped to this weekend. And as has so often happened with so many of us, the bump became another bump, and who knows when I'll eventually get back out to Seattle, but I'm very glad that you all were happy to have me and make the pivot to the virtual event this evening so that I could be with you. So I have about a 25 minute visual presentation with some information and backstory on Edge of the Map. So Claire will be running those slides and I'll kind of prompt her. But I'm happy to be answering any questions at the end of the presentation, and hopefully there will be a bunch of them. So yeah, without further ado, Claire, you can put up that first image. I think it's of the book cover. This is Edge of the Map. Claire had it in her hands just a minute ago. It is my second book. My first book, I think this next image, Claire, is my first book, which is called Awakening East. And it is about the adoption of my two children from China and our subsequent move to China from Denver, where I'm a writer based in Denver, when we lived there for about a year, and it was a very wacky year. And so Awakening East was my first book, published in 2015, as I mentioned, and I've now been working on, I guess, about 6 or 7 years, I've been working on books full time. Prior to that, as you heard, I had a number of different careers. I'm trained as a journalist and as a lawyer. I worked in nonprofits for many years out here in Denver, and I taught at Regis University for about 10 years, and now I am writing full time. This next image is one that I love to start with. It is a picture of Mount Everest, and I'm suspecting that a lot of you might recognize this picture because it's an image that was taken last May by Nims Persia, who is a Nepalese mountaineer, and he was attempting to summit Mount Everest. And as you can see, it just shows this really sort of catastrophic queue of climbers on the way to the summit. And I'm including it here to illustrate where my journey with Edge of the Map started. And it was because, like so many of you, I have always been fascinated by mountain stories. I am not a climber, I'm not a mountaineer, but for my entire life, I have been drawn to stories that take place in the mountains. And I've always wanted to understand the mentality of climbers, the risks and the drama, the losses, and obviously the grief and those exhilarating highs that mountaineers experience. All of it has been just super fascinating to me. So after the publication of Awakening East, I began to look for a second book project. And I had 3 projects in mind. One was, I guess I'd call it sort of a fluffy piece of chick lit. The second was a deep dive into China's one-child policy, which was unraveling in about 2015. And I was very interested in that. And then there was a story that my mother, who was also a writer, had been working on, and it was the story of Christine Boskoff. So she had been working on Christine Boskoff's story for about 10 years, but she slowly began to realize that she wouldn't be able to finish because she had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and the advancement of the disease had become pronounced. And at that point, she decided she couldn't work on the book anymore, and I offered to help her. So I will share a little bit more about how Mom got involved with Chris's story at the end of the presentation here in a few minutes. But let me just tell you how I picked Christine's story from these 3. So I took all 3 stories to my writing group, which is this fabulous group of brilliant and talented women here in Denver, who we meet every month to kind of share our writing and support each other. And I described all 3 projects. And as soon as I started describing Christine Boskoff's story, you can imagine what happened, which was everybody said, this is the one. This is the story that had to be told. So off I went. I didn't really have a clue how deep I was going to be diving into the story, but her story was incredibly compelling. And I, of course, had heard bits and pieces of it over the years, as my mother had been working on the story, she had done quite a bit of research. She hadn't started to write quite yet. The sort of professional headline from Chris's life was that she was the only American woman to have summited 6 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks. And that was a record she had set in the year 2000. And it's actually a record which still stands today, 20 years later, which is really quite remarkable. Chris had gone from a successful career as an aerospace engineer into the sport of mountaineering in her mid-20s. She and her husband, Keith, who was 17 years older than her, had bought Seattle adventure company Mountain Madness, which many of you I know are familiar with, from the estate of Scott Fisher, who was a guide who died on Everest in 1996. And a lot of us remember that tragedy through the lens of John Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air. So Claire, I think I have a picture of Into Thin Air, which is the next image. Right. So this is Into Thin Air, which I'm sure many of you have read and enjoyed. And it's kind of one of these classic mountaineering narratives. The next is an image of Chris, which I love. So Chris had just an absolutely breathtaking rise in the sport of mountaineering. And given that she was a woman, her accomplishments were even more notable, as it was a sport, was and still is a sport dominated by men. She never saw her gender as something that defined her. And so to me, that is what really made her story so captivating and so inspiring. It was who she was as a person and how she approached this passion in her life with such great humility that really made her story one that I felt needed to be told in this moment in time. So there are many twists and turns in the narrative, but what is not a spoiler is that in 2006, Chris perished in an avalanche in Western China with her climbing partner and boyfriend, who was the iconic Charlie Fowler, an iconic rock climber who was based out here in Telluride. And I think this next picture is Charlie and Chris together. This is actually the last picture taken of Chris and Charlie as they were going off on that last expedition. So Chris and Charlie had gone to explore a remote part of Sichuan province. And when they didn't return on their flight home, a search and rescue was launched. And at the time, they were both living in Norwood, Colorado, just outside Telluride. And so the search involved this coordinated effort between friends in Norwood and Telluride and the Seattle offices of Mountain Madness, as well as officials in China. And I'm suspecting that many of you here tonight or watching later remember that search and rescue because it was very complicated, very much full of mystery, very emotional and frantic. And it was taking place right before the holidays. This was in mid-December of 2006. And it actually came on the heels of another search and rescue that was happening on Mount Hood, which also ended in a bit of a tragedy. So I'm guessing a lot of you kind of remember both of these experiences. The next picture we've got is the picture of Genyan. There's Genyan, and you can sort of see the line that they climbed off there on the right. I've got kind of the red dot marked, and then there's sort of a yellow line going upwards. That's the line that they took. So this process began for me. And as I began looking into Chris's story, the first place I went was research. And I poured over all of my mother's research and began reading every book that I could that fell into the category of what I would call mountaineering literature. And some of these books were better than others. Most were written by men. Most were memoirs. And book after book started to be captivating, but eventually a lot of them began to sound the same. And at that point, I began to realize that what I wanted to read didn't exist. And what I wanted as a non-mountaineer was a mountaineering narrative that could teach me something about the sport, but also had humanity and depth. And at this point, I knew Chris very well because I had access to some of her journals and I'd begun to talk to her friends and family. And so I knew I wanted to capture her spirit, but I wasn't just interested in a biography. I was really fascinated by, as I've mentioned, the details around climbing, the science around training for big expeditions. I was very interested in the complexities of those expeditions. I was really interested in something that could teach and move and inspire kind of all at once. And so what I wanted to write was a book that didn't exist, and it was a book that I myself would want to read. And so this was a turning point because I realized that didn't exist, and certainly not with a female alpinist at the center of the story. think there's another picture of Chris, which is next, Claire. Right. So this project, as you can imagine, quickly got bigger than I had planned. I ended up interviewing, as Claire mentioned, over 75 people. I read everything I could get my hands on. I traveled to Seattle and Telluride and Norwood, and eventually I was able to travel to China to retrace Chris and Charlie's last steps. So throughout this process, and this is actually something I think that's happening with the readers, I'm hearing this a lot. As I was researching and beginning to write, I was constantly falling down what I describe as these rabbit holes as a writer. And that was because so much of this world is so juicy and so intriguing, which is why we read mountaineering narratives so voraciously. The lifestyles, the personalities, the expeditions, the Sherpa support staff, the environmental impact of mountaineering, the spirituality and ethics of climbing sacred peaks, of which Genyan Peak, the last mountain that they were attempting to summit, was a sacred peak. I became very interested in how trauma and loss affects people in the world of climbing. And then obviously the role of women in leadership positions in these sports dominated by men. So I wanted to include all of this. And ultimately, I think I was able to include most of those topics. And so what we have, I believe, is a book that really has a little bit of something for everybody. And lots of people are getting lost doing lots of research as they're reading the book. But all of it is really grounded in this story of this very humble woman and her passion to climb. So just a few other intros as we dive into the book. I want to tell you about a couple other people you'll meet in the story. The next image is Keith Boskoff, and this is Chris's husband. He got her hooked on the sport of mountaineering. They were both living in Atlanta. She was working for Lockheed Martin and went to hear him give a speech on an expedition. I think he had climbed Aconcagua, and they eventually struck up a friendship and then a romance, and off they went. And then I've got, Claire, two pictures of Scott Fisher. This is the first one, and you can put up the next one anytime while I'm talking. So Scott Fisher and Chris met one time. They met in 1995, which is the year before Scott died on Everest. And I was actually able to recreate that scene with quite a bit of help. So part of the challenge with writing this book was that so many of the main players had died. And I was adamant that the book remain wholly a work of nonfiction, so that in the few scenes that I wanted to include with no living people to speak to, I really had to rely heavily on other sources to kind of vet those scenes and make those scenes authentic. So I would write the scenes from whatever information I had, and then I would run those scenes past many people who knew, who could speak to the authenticity of those scenes, just to make sure that I had everything right. And it was pretty arduous, but I think I came out with a pretty good and very believable book. Obviously, it's entirely nonfiction. So then we've got a couple pictures of Charlie Fowler. There's one picture coming up that's Charlie Fowler in his younger years. This is in the mid to late 80s out here in Colorado. He was doing ice climbing. This is a picture taken by Alex Lowe, who many of you may remember. And then there's an older Charlie Fowler picture, a black and white. This is sort of towards the end of his life. The next person you'll meet in the book is Jane Courage, and I've got an image of Jane Courage and Chris right here. She was Christine's best friend, and luckily, Jane is still with us, and she's become a dear friend of mine as well. She was really instrumental in helping me write the book, because she was able to give me a lot of insight into Chris's personality and her quirks and her funny sense of humor. So I was very grateful to have Jane in my life and in Chris's life, obviously, as well. And then I've got a picture of Kili Sherpa. Kili Sherpa was Christine's lead Sherpa in the time that she was running Mountain Madness. He was her lead Sherpa in Nepal. He ran the Nepal operations of Mountain Madness, and he still is very involved with Mountain Madness as well. And he was with Chris when she summited Everest for the very first time in the year 2000. We actually just marked the 20th anniversary of her summit of Mount Everest. She attempted that summit with legendary mountaineer Peter Habeler. Peter was not able to summit, but Chris went ahead and was able to summit Mount Everest. So I'm going to read just a very short section from this particular chapter, and it is a moment in their tent. Killy and Chris are in a tent. I think it was Camp 2 or maybe 3, towards the end of their attempt. And she was very much wanting to summit Everest without oxygen. And Killy was encouraging her to take oxygen. So this is that scene in the tent. Chris, you should use oxygen. We're at South Col. You need it now. I don't want it, she said. Even if I did, I don't have a tank. Killy nodded, pulling his mask off and holding it out to her. Her blue eyes looked tired, her voice weak. The space between them felt strained by the disagreement. Yes, I know, he said. You can use mine. If you're beaten up by the altitude, it's a big problem here. Even myself, strong Sherpa, I get very tired. She balked at the idea. I really wanted to do this without O's, Killy. I really did, and Peter did too. You've come to climb Everest, Chris. You're strong, stronger than me, but if you get sick... Killy couldn't begin to think about her falling ill on his watch. They stared at each other, neither budging until Chris spoke. Just to get through the night? Yes, just that. She reached for the mask in silence as Killy adjusted the dial on the regulator. Placing it over her mouth and nose, she inhaled, closing her eyes. Oxygen poured into her body, precious and life-sustaining. As she drew in 3 more breaths, her body softened into the sleeping bag. She removed the mask and handed it to Killy, who took 3 breaths of his own. Taking turns with the mask, the 2 gradually fell into hypoxic sleep. So Chris and Killy up there at the tip top of Mount Everest. Claire, the next picture is Genyon, if you've got that one ready. This is the Genyon Valley, the site of Chris and Charlie's last trip. And it is just an astonishingly beautiful river valley with these beautiful jagged peaks and rushing rivers. And it's up at about 16,000 feet. This monastery sits at 16,000 feet. So obviously very few inhabitants aside from the monks who live at the monastery. And as I mentioned, I traveled there to be able to write those final chapters of the book in a really authentic way, as authentic as I could. And it was truly magical, life-changing experience. I think being there more than anything in this wild place helped me understand what drove Chris and Charlie and all mountaineers to seek such unexplored places, just a gorgeous, gorgeous valley. And then I think, Claire, there's one more picture. It's me at Genyon with a couple of the monks who live at that monastery. They were really invaluable to me. A couple of them remembered Chris and Charlie, and so I was able to talk to them about the power of the mountains and what they remembered from those interactions with Chris and Charlie. It was a little dicey because I only speak Chinese, and it's very rough Chinese, like very basic Chinese. And some of the monks spoke Chinese, but a lot of them only spoke Tibetan, and I do not speak Tibetan. So it was kind of this funny interaction with drawing pictures and whatnot, you can imagine. So I want to close by getting back to the start of the journey and maybe a word or two about something I took away, and something that Oz is a good topic of discussion when people finish the book. So I mentioned at the start that the book was one that my mom had started years ago, and the backstory of how it landed in my lap is something that I think is worth noting. So Chris and I were both raised in Appleton, Wisconsin, and it's a city in northeast Wisconsin, about as far away from the greater Himalayan range as you can possibly be. Chris was 3 years older than me, and we went to the same high school, and we only lived a few miles apart, but we never met. We graduated, and we both left Appleton, and eventually both of us ended up here in Colorado. Chris ended up with Charlie in Telluride, and I ended up here in Denver with my family. And as I said, I wasn't a climber. Still not a climber, and I wasn't in that world, and so I didn't know who she was. But the bigger and more compelling reason is because she was so humble. She had summited more 8,000-meter peaks than any other American woman, which makes her the counterpart to Ed Viesturs to this day. And his name is obviously very well known in mountaineering circles and beyond, but she was so very under the radar that even being from the same hometown, I didn't know her. So it wasn't until 2006, when Chris and Charlie went missing, that there was a very small article in our hometown paper in Appleton, Wisconsin. And my mom saw it and asked if I remembered Chris. And I didn't. And my mother was intrigued and began looking into Chris's story. And once she understood the depth of Chris's accomplishments, she was convinced the story needed to be told. So at that point, she reached out to Chris's mom, who lived just a few miles away. The women forged this really lovely friendship that was carried on for many years as Mom worked on the book. And then eventually that friendship was passed on to me, along with Mom's boxes of research, and the hopes that one day Chris's story would be told. And so I'm very happy to say that it has been told, and it was published April 1st by Mountaineers Books right there in Seattle. So I really love ending it there, and also love just closing by reminding everybody that I just kind of came at this project as a regular person who was not a mountaineer, but just captivated by stories that take place in the mountains. And so it's a story that is incredibly compelling, not just for those of us who are living or climbing, but beyond. Armchair climbers is kind of who I'm hoping the book appeals to more than anything. And happy to take questions now.
Wow. Thank you. I'm going to enable the chat again. So there we go. So anyone in the audience who has questions about this story, please feel free to type them into the chat or put them again in that Ask a Question feature. We do have a comment from Amy Smith Bell, your copy editor at Mountaineers Books. So she was saying hello and go you.
Yay, go me. But thank you, Amy. Good to have a very good editor, right? Keeping you on track.
Yeah. So I have to say, I remember very well when Into Thin Air came out, and I remember seeing your pictures of Scott Fisher really just kind of brought all that back, and then seeing that line up to Everest, that is so troubling and so disturbing to me. And is that's what's still happening right now? Is there's just that? Well, what are we in a season right now where people are summiting Everest or no?
No.
Okay.
The mountain was closed this past season because of coronavirus. And so kind of bummer for those people who wanted to climb it, but yay for the mountain, right? To have a little bit of a rest. And I think that there was some amount of trash pickup and whatnot, which is great. And so that season, that 2019 season, I think was one that had a lot of people sort of questioning, how can we do this better? So I am hopeful that there'll be some more regulations to limit the number of climbers over there, because it has gotten incredibly crowded, which causes a number of different issues, as you can imagine.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So it's interesting to me. I think a lot of people might wonder about what this was like to write, what it was to write this book, not being a climber yourself. So when you were researching this, did you find that to be a particular challenge? Were there people who ever sort of questioned your was there anybody who ever was like, you don't have the right to write this? I'm wondering about that. Was there anybody who was like, wait a minute, you're not a climber. Why do you get to write this story? Well, did that happen at all, or were people pretty gracious and kind about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it never happened directly to my face at all. But I suspect I had to work a little harder at getting conversations going in certain cases. Most people were extraordinarily thrilled to talk to me because the people I was talking to were friends of Chris and Charlie who really wanted the story to be told. But every now and then I would get on the phone with somebody and I could tell this person is going to take a little bit of work to kind of crack. But I'm okay at that. I'm good at that. And I have a lot of patience and I'm a pretty good listener. And I think it ended up being an advantage to me not being a climber because in some ways, because then I kind of came at a lot of these conversations as a blank slate. And I was asking people to kind of help me understand. And people, as you can imagine, love to talk. and I'm happy to listen. So I let people just talk and talk and talk, and eventually they warmed up. So there were only a couple of people, 2 or 3 people, who really refused to talk to me at all.
Oh, interesting.
But that happens. That happens when you're working on a book about somebody's life. It's a great responsibility to have that legacy in your hands, I think.
Right. And you said that this was a story that initially it was your mother who was interested, and she is the one who was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And so we do have, I think, Michelle in the audience. Is that her name? I want to make sure I get the name right. Yes, Michelle is wondering, is your mom still alive, and did she get to see the book come to fruition?
Yeah, she is still with us. Her Parkinson's is quite advanced right now, but I had the project turned over to me in 2017. So in the time that I was researching and writing, which was 2017, 18, and a little bit into 2019, she was still able to help me a little bit with editing. Okay. And I would go back to her and ask her for advice on certain things, a teeny tiny bit. And when the manuscript was in its final stages, she was able to read the whole manuscript. Now it's a little bit beyond her, but she was able to read basically the final product and was so happy that it came out. It was very different, I think, than what she would have written. So that was a real leap of faith for her to kind of just say, here you go. I've been working on this for 10 years and I know it's not going to be exactly what I envisioned, but I think she was just so committed to having the story told in any form, and that I was doing it was special. So,
oh, good. I'm glad that she got to see the end product.
Yeah.
So Melissa has a comment and a question and a comment. So, okay, Johanna, wow, you have made a book I have wanted to read. Even more intriguing, awesome backstory. So, how long was it before Chris was found?
So, okay, so these are spoilers. Do you want me to give spoilers? I think she asked the question. So do I just go for it? What do you think, Claire?
Oh,
or does Melissa find me offline? I know.
Well, how about this? She has a second follow-up question, so maybe we can talk about that one while we mull over. Do we want to do spoilers? So, she says, she notice your comparisons to the accomplishments of Ed Viesturs. She finds those comparisons kind of shocking since she has never heard of Chris.
I know.
It's very sad. But it also, she said, it shows her humility or her humbleness. So anyway, she can't wait to read your book. So I guess she's not really making a question other than saying she's shocked that, you're comparing her to Ed Viesturs, and why have we not heard of Christine Boskoff before?
Yeah.
And it's true.
That's the story. Right. So that's the story, that there are all of these male mountaineers who we all know, Conrad Anker, Ed Viesturs, John Krakauer's a mountaineer of sorts. But Christine Boskoff is from Seattle, and people in Seattle have never heard of her. And she's the same caliber. She holds this record for mountaineering, 6 of the world's 8,000 meter peaks, and nobody's ever heard of her. And it's really pretty incredible. So that was the reason.
She's held that record for so long now.
20 years. Yeah, 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah. And she's also quite extraordinary. Aside from the mountaineering, the fact that she owned a major guiding company, she owned Mountain Madness, we're talking the late 90s. She was the only woman to own a major guiding company.
Right.
And so professionally and personally, she was kind of breaking barriers all over the place, but it wasn't on her radar screen that she was doing that. She just loved to climb. So.
Wow. Well, so what was one of the most surprising things that you learned on this project?
Oh, gosh. I think it was very surprising to me that she and I could both be from this small town in the Midwest with an altitude of like 750 feet. and that she had no problem acclimatizing. And I've spent some amount of time in Nepal myself, and also I live in Colorado, and I do not do well at altitude. It's just a
really?
really individual thing. Yeah, I do not do well at all. So when I was on the top of like an 18,000-foot mountain in Nepal, all I could think of was, I am a girl from Appleton and I should not be up here. And this was also in 1995. So this was actually, Chris and I were actually in Nepal the same year for the very first time, which is, I know there are all these really interesting intersections. And I just remember thinking, this is not for girls from Appleton. And meanwhile, she was just up there loving life. So that was surprising to me. The science behind high altitude climbing was fascinating.
And how bad did you feel on your worst day? Because that's one thing that always sticks in my mind whenever I heard John Krakauer speak. And he said, imagine being the worst hangover, like a hangover's hangover, the worst hangover of your life. You're so sick you can't even pick up the phone to call in to work because you feel so bad. And they feel that way and still go up and summit a mountain.
Yes.
Did you experience pretty bad sickness?
I did. And I think Chris's symptoms were obviously much less because it's kind of all on the spectrum. But for me, for sure, worst headache you've ever had. Like all you can do is sort of lie there, don't want to eat, feel nauseous. Also, everything is fuzzy and sort of my decision making is not great. So it's a whole, and a lot of the people watching kind of have experienced as well. I mean, this can happen on the top of Mount Rainier as well. You don't have to be in the high Himalaya for this. So, yeah.
I just have such admiration for people who can carry on, proceed, and still go to the summit and feel that awful. So you said that when you were trying to decide which project to really pursue, you said you had 3 in the works. Are you working on something now completely different, or did you decide to go with one of the other 2 that you were working on earlier? Or what are you working on now?
Right. Yes, good question. So I have sort of put the other 2 aside for now because I so enjoyed working on this piece of literature. And so I would love to stay in the genre of mountaineering literature or outdoor adventure writing. Anything with a female protagonist is really interesting to me, definitely nonfiction. So I'm kind of in the process of collecting stories and listening to find my next book. That's where I am now. I'm really committed to sticking with Edge through the end of the year in terms of promotion and whatnot. The promotion and the marketing and all of that has gotten really stretched out because of coronavirus. Releasing a book, as you know, in the middle of a pandemic has been a little bit catastrophic. So everything's taking a lot longer. Yeah. No book tour and all of that. But at the same time, I'm getting to talk to lots of people who I never would have talked to through this kind of medium. So I'm sticking with Edge, looking for new projects, and I've had a good amount of interest from people who've read the book and are interested in film or TV adaptations for the book. So that's something
I would think this would be a very compelling movie or TV or something. But
I think so too. Yeah.
Let's see. Here we have a question from Lynn. I wonder if many of the participants are aware of a book describing the journeys of women alpinists who climb K2. Savage Mountain, she thinks is the name of it. Are you familiar? And she also wants to say that she's so happy that you've written a book about Chris. But are you familiar with Savage Mountain?
Yes. Okay. Also a fabulous book. I think it's, I don't know, maybe 10 years old, and it's written by Jennifer Jordan, who's a journalist. I think she lives in Montana, and it's about 5 or 6 women who summited K2 and all died eventually in the mountains. So it's a dangerous sport, or it has the propensity to be a dangerous sport. Yes.
And it was sad to me to hear when you were talking about how there's just really not many books about this, about women alpinists. And
Right.
you're right.
Right.
There's, you just rattled off a whole list of all these male climbers that we all know. But
Right. Right. Yeah. It is quite extraordinary. I kind of got into it. And then at one point I was on sort of a list of the top 100 mountaineering books. And there really isn't any book that's written by or about an American female mountaineer. So now there's this one. My friend Allison Levine, who's a mountaineer, has sort of a business book that she's put out. And Vanessa O'Brien, who was the first American and British woman to summit K2, she did that in 2017. She's coming out with her memoir in about 6 months. So there'll be two books in the past year by and or about an American female mountaineer. So there should be more, shouldn't there?
Yes, there should be. Well, that's all that we have for questions so far, unless anybody has, if you want to type in real quickly. But I want to say thank you so much for sharing your photos. The photos were amazing. The pictures of the monastery and the mountainside where the little community is located is so gorgeous. How long ago? When was the last time you were there?
I was there in 2018, so a couple years ago. Yeah, very special to be able to be there. Yeah. Magical.
Oh, here is a very interesting question that John is asking. In your research, did you note any difference in the spirituality that shows up among women climbers and men climbers?
In the spirituality.
And a difference in the spirituality between male and female climbers.
That's a good question. Now, to be honest, I probably, the people in terms of the mountaineers and climbers I talk to, because of the nature of the sport, 90% of the mountaineers I talked to were men. And again, a very few select were women. In terms of the spirituality, I don't think so. I mean, I think the easy answer would be to say women were just naturally more aware of that sort of thing. But I found some very authentic and real and passionate male mountaineers who were very cognizant of the mountains that they were summiting and made very certain that they were doing that in the right way when they were climbing sacred peaks. Not all peaks are designated as sacred peaks, but I think it just depends on the person. And I don't know that has any distinction because of gender.
Oh, yeah. I would think that, and this is fully just my opinion, but I would almost feel like there is a mountaineer, kind of a collective mountaineer spirituality. I'm sure that everyone has their own unique spirituality, but I would feel like there's also just kind of a collective one too. That if you are a mountaineer, you just sort of feel. I don't know. That's just. I
think you're being optimistic. No, I think a lot of mountaineers are just out there to bag the peak, and they don't really care about the culture or the community. That's real. I don't know what the percentage is, but that is a real thing. So
yes,
luckily I didn't run into any of those folks, but
yes, and
that's why you have a catastrophic queue climbing Mount Everest, right?
Right, the peak baggers. Yep.
Yes.
And then someone did just put in another recommendation, Annapurna, A Woman's Place by Arlene Bloom.
Yeah. That's a great book. And I included a little quote from Arlene Bloom in my book as well. So she's in there.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been been fun. And again, here, just so everybody can see, this is the book right there. And again, the green button, center screen, purchase edge of the map here. That takes you right to the Village Books website where you can purchase this book. And again, book sales are one way that we are able to maintain our stellar event programming at Village Books. Mm-hmm. So we encourage purchases of the book. If you're watching this recorded on YouTube, if you look in the description down below, you will also see that same link to the Village Books website. So, Johanna, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been great. I am definitely one of those authors who responds to email. So if your listeners or viewers have questions that come up afterwards, they can always find me on my website, which is johannagarton.com. And I am also doing a ton of book clubs right now. Book clubs are reading the book, and then I'm doing Zoom meetings with book clubs after they're done, which is super special because a lot of times book clubs never get to talk to an author. And this book in particular has lots of people wanting answers and lots of questions after they're done reading it. So I'm happy to do that, and they can find me on my
website. Good. Mm-hmm. Yes. We book clubs love authors who are willing to sit in. I'm the leader of a book club. My book group myself. So.
Could be your next read.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you. And everyone have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Stay safe. And I think we're going to say over and out.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.